Good morning. It's good to see you guys. It's really good to see you. It feels like I haven't seen you since last year. Yeah, I got it. I told Libby that I was going to tell a joke as I came up, and she knew exactly what I was going to say. So she knows me better than anybody else, and also spoils my jokes most of the time. This is the first service of 2020, and it's kind of weird to say. It's 2020 already, and it feels like it was not that long ago that 2019 had just started. But now we're here in the year 2020, and it causes me to ask myself, where did the year go? It feels like it went by really, really quickly. Every year when January hits, I find myself asking this question, where did the year go? And at this time of year, it's officially the time where I start planning out the logistics of summer, of camp and CIY and the conferences we go to. We have CIY Believe for the middle school that we're going to be going to. We have Move for the high school that we're taking students to. And Libby and I are working at a summer camp as well. And these camps and conferences, they've always been really awesome for our groups every single year because it's always made a big impact on our students. If you'd indulge me a little bit this morning, I'd like to give you a little bit of a report of my last summer of 2019. As I think back, last summer was marked by two categories. The first category was conferences and camp, and the second category was student growth. For this first category, camps and conferences, I think about the fact that I attended 3 different camps that we went to. I got to teach at one and kind of be a counselor, and at the other, Libby and I had the opportunity to be co-deans of that camp, and we got to know some students that we had never met before, and in a short span of time, we developed a pretty good relationship with those kids. And then we took our high school students to CIY Move, and the purpose of this conference is to train students to become kingdom workers, to use their talents, their individual talents, to build God's kingdom. Every year, I think it has a really good impact on our students, and it challenges them not only to grow personally and individually in their relationship with Jesus, but also together as a group with each other. And this leads us to our second category, which is student growth. Last summer, our group saw a spike in student growth, and I attribute that some to camps, some to Bible study, but mainly to the fact that we've decided that it's really important that we see each other and we spend time with one another, and that we show that we don't just say that we care about each other, but that we show it by the fact that we're willing to be with one another and sacrifice time and other things like that to be with one another. And with that, we saw a spike in the involvement in our students, not only in youth group, but also in different activities throughout the church. The passion of our students has really come alive, and it's been really encouraging to see. But thinking about all this, it causes to raise up in me a deep passion, but also a burden that I have. And it's the call to raise up the next generation, and I believe that it's a call that a lot of us, in fact, all of us in this church, are called to. It has a lot to do with every single one of us in the church, but I think it also has a lot to do with marbles. If you look at the little graphic in the back, you'll see a hand and there's a marble in there. I'll let you wonder what that's about for a little bit. I'll come back to it. But to start out the sermon this morning, I'd like to go through Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9. If you have your Bible, you can follow along. I'll just read it, and then you can follow along in your Bible if you have it. If not, you can listen. So to set the stage, Moses stood before the people of Israel as they prepared to head into the promised land. And this passage is his challenge to them, to the nation, to be a people and individual households that follow and honor God. So this is how our passage begins. Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9. These are the commands, decrees, and laws of the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Now, I think it doesn't take much to catch the heart of this passage, and it's raising the next generation to follow God in the way that they're called to. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to examine the first two verses that I think are extremely important to both the Jewish faith, but also to the Christian faith as well. It's Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5 up here on the screen. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." These two verses, I think, are really important, and they're being recited by Jewish individuals in synagogues all throughout the world this weekend. They'll be spoken in Jewish homes. It's posted on their door frames in their houses. These two verses are a really big deal, and they're actually given a name. These verses, their name is called the Shema. But where did that name come from? Well, I'm glad you asked, because if you didn't, I wouldn't be able to continue the sermon this morning. The answer is actually found in the very first word of these verses. Shema is the Hebrew word that is translated to hear or listen. But I want to pause for a second. When we see the word hear, we often think about when we have sound traveling into our ear and we can pick that up. That's what we think of when we think of the word hear. But this word means so much more than that. To fully understand it means that we see that the word Shema is a call to listen, pay attention, and respond. And here's why I pause on this one for a moment. By starting with the word Shema, Moses was saying, listen, Israel, pay attention. The Lord is God, He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. So Israel, because you are paying attention to this, respond by loving God and acting out what He calls you to do. This morning, church, I want to encourage you to grab a hold of this truth. It's one thing to listen, but it's another thing entirely to Shema, to meditate on what God calls us to do, to pay attention to it, and to respond to it, to Shema. Now, to get to the main point of the message that's been kind of resonating with me over the last couple months, the call of Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9 is not only to personally live out the Shema, but also to pass it on to the next generation. This becomes very clear in the immediate instructions following the Shema. This is what verse 6 says. It says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts." And the call is to live it out. Then in the beginning of verse 7, it says, "Impress them on your children," which means to pass it on to the next generation. Make sure that they're raised up in a way that they understand how important it is to not only love God, but to follow Him and live it out in their everyday life. The passage continues on all the way through verse 9, and it says this, "Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates." So if we look at these verses really closely, Moses is talking about an all-encompassing call to the people of Israel to raise up the next generation to live out Shema. He's saying to do all things for Christ all day long, for God all day long. If we catch the words when, we see that we are to do it when we sit, when we walk, when we lie down, and when we get up. He says to do it in all settings, when we're at home and all along the road. He says it needs to be the highest priority in our lives. And that's what he's getting at in verse 8, with the picture of having symbols on your hands and on your forehead. And finally, he says that it needs to happen while your children are still under your roof. I think that's what he's getting at in verse 9 when he highlights houses and gates. That might be a little more subtle in this passage, but there are definitely passages all throughout Scripture that talk about the importance of instilling faith during the time of formative years while students and children are under our care. Probably the most blatant scripture that challenges us toward this idea is found in Proverbs 22:6. It's one most of us probably know. "Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not part from it." A lot of us might know that verse, and maybe some of you have it hanging in your room, or maybe it's in your bathroom, somewhere throughout your house. You know this passage, you know this verse. And it's probably something that you would see as a promise to you. But the reality of this verse is perhaps we should see it as a call or a command, maybe even a challenge, something that we're called to do. which finally brings me back to marbles, this interesting picture in the background. You're probably looking at it and wondering, is there a marble in this guy's hand in the background? What's the significance of that? What's the importance? What does it have to do with Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9? And the answer is 936. 936. You see, 936 has a meaning when it comes to raising up the next generation. It is approximately 930 weeks from birth until high school graduation. 936 weeks. So letting one of these marbles represent a single week, this means that from the time the child is born until your child graduates, it's around 936 weeks. From the moment that little child enters the world, the countdown started. With each passing week, a marble comes out of the jar. Now, I know that the congregation isn't limited to just newborn children, so let's take a look at the visuals and maybe some of the most significant transition ages in this 936-week span. Once kindergarten starts, we get pretty specific in our timing. It's 624 weeks until they graduate. 624. This is a big shift as we run into the formative grade school years and when we hit the big transition into middle school. Once you get to 6th grade, we're down to 364 marbles, which is a big chunk that's already gone. 364 hormonally charged marbles. At this point, you've already lost nearly 2/3 of our marbles. If you have a 6th grader at home, you know how that goes. Then when your kid walks through the doors of high school as a freshman, you're now down to 208. 208 marbles. And then for the parents of high schoolers in the room, in case you wanted to get a little depressed this morning, once your student becomes a senior, consider the fact that you're down to 52. 52 marbles left. 52 marbles to make an impact before the next phase of their life. Now, I know what you're thinking maybe as a parent or a grandparent this morning. Thanks for equally depressing me and freaking me out at the same time. Please know that neither of those emotions are my goal this morning. But I know that some of us in this room might be resistant to the idea of doing a countdown. You may be thinking, don't make me focus on how much time I have left. Let me focus on the time I have now. And that's the way we kind of typically think. But this visual of the marbles comes from the people over at Orange, an organization that focuses on the strategic partnership between the church and the family in raising up the next generation. Reggie Joyner, the CEO of Orange, says this when it comes to keeping track of your marbles. He says, when you see how much time you have left, you tend to get serious about the time you have now. And I think that's true of our students, and I think that's true as and maybe if you're a parent or maybe if you're in my position as a youth pastor. We aren't counting down with dread. Instead, we're paying attention to the time we have left, so we'll be motivated to make the countdown count. Now, I want to pause for a moment to make sure that we're all tracking with each other this morning. I know that the grandparents and parents might be super drawn in and super focused, but I understand that we're a congregation with people who may be empty nesters, people who aren't yet parents, singles, and maybe those of us who in this room are actually in this age group. So you might be thinking, well, this morning was kind of a waste of my time. But here's where you come in, and I don't want you to miss this. It's super important. You are essential to this. This is the responsibility of the family and the church. I believe that the biblical model outlined in Deuteronomy and in other places point to the home as the place where primary discipleship should be occurring. But the church family is also to work in partnership with the home. It's meant to be a both-and situation. When I see this partnership functioning properly, it's a really beautiful thing, and I'm sure you've seen that as well. When the discipleship is occurring at home and you can tell that parents are invested in the spiritual growth of their kids, and when you can tell that there are people within the church who are supportive of those kids as well, it's a really beautiful thing. However, there can be moments when this investment isn't taking place at home. It's in these moments that the church has the opportunity to play its normal role, but it also has the opportunity to step up and play the family role as well. And when this kind of a situation happens, it's also a beautiful thing. I have a youth pastor friend. His name is Derry, which, by the way, what kind of like mean parent names their kid Derry? Uh, if you know a Derry, I'm sorry, my bad. But my friend Derry, he's a youth pastor, and he told me about two students in his ministry, Brad and Kelly. Brad and Kelly both graduated from his ministry in 2003, okay? That shows how old Derry is and how young I am. In 2003, I was in third grade, so just for reference for you. So Kelsey, she came from a family that took the call of Deuteronomy 6 seriously. They were investing in her spiritual journey at home. When Kelsey jumped into the youth group, she found a group of friends and developed key friendships with other students from different schools who were also focusing on their relationship with Jesus. Derry's wife became a mentor to her. And one summer camp, at camp, kind of like the camp that we take our students to, CIY, Kelsey fully surrendered her life and future over to Christ. And then we get to Brad, and Brad's situation was a little bit different. Brad came from a tough home. His dad wasn't around much, and when he was around, he was slightly violent, and his mom had drug issues. Needless to say, his parents didn't really attend church much, and they weren't all too interested in their son's spiritual growth. But Brad, he was blessed enough to have someone invite him to go to youth group, and he dove in, and the church dove back. People from the church, Bruce and Sue, became spiritual parents to him. These weren't volunteers, by the way. They were just people. Sean, his small group leader, became like a big brother. My youth pastor friend Derry says that he'll never forget one Wednesday night when Brad and a bunch of his friends, a bunch of his buddies, they were hanging out in his office, and Derry was really tired, and so he asked them, "Don't you guys want to go home?" And Brad looked at him and said, "Derry, you don't get it. This is my home." Well, Brad and Kelsey, they not only fell in love with Jesus through their experience in youth group, they also ended up falling in love with each other, which is a beautiful love story. Brad became one of the best youth pastors Derry has ever known, and I've had the opportunity to meet him. He's a really great guy. And Brad and Kelly are seeking to raise their 3 kids to follow the Shema, to not only love God, but to follow him, to do what he calls them to do, and be who he calls them to be. Now, I don't want you to hear Brad's story and misunderstand what I'm saying. Although Brad had people from the church step up and raise him in the way he should go, he would tell you that there's no substitute for discipleship from your parents. While the church family has an important role to play in the discipleship of our students, I personally believe that there is no better youth pastor for your students, for your kids, than you, their parents. You're a better youth pastor than I could ever be. You'll have a bigger impact than I ever will. But whether that's present in the home or not, we as the church are important to the spiritual development of the next generation. In the world of children and youth ministries, there's this thing known as the 5-to-1 ratio. And the idea is whether it's a weekly program or a retreat, you're supposed to have 1 adult leader to every 5 students. The general thought is that this ratio gives good coverage to all the kids or students to make sure that nothing gets burnt down and no student ends up dead. That's the idea of the ratio. Chap Clark, he's a great youth ministry mind. He's over at the Fuller Theological Seminary, and he's challenged this ratio. He asked the question, what if we flipped it? What if we were to seek to get 5 caring adults to invest in the spiritual journey of 1 student? What if we flipped it? Let me take it a step further. What if moms and dads in this church were able to confidently identify 5 individuals intentionally investing in their child's journey along every step of the way? And there's only one way that can happen, and that's through us intentionally investing in our students, in the next generation. There are some great people, great mentors in our community that come in the form of educators and coaches. And a lot of them love Jesus, and they want to see students grow. But they can sometimes run into limitations to what they can do and say when it comes to spiritual investment. There was a teacher in the big town that was close to us, and he had started doing a Bible study with students before school. Long story short, some parents heard that he was doing this, and they didn't want their kids learning stuff from the Bible, so he ended up getting fired. And I'm not saying that's the situation that is in every single school district. I'm not saying that's something that would happen here. But my point is that sometimes in that kind of a setting, there might be a roadblock when it comes to being able to invest fully in the spiritual growth of students. But we're blessed to live in a country where we can freely gather together as the Indianola Church of Christ and celebrate who Jesus is and fully grow together. And that's the purpose of God's church, all of us coming together to use our individual abilities to help grow the church and also to grow spiritually, grow closer to Jesus. We can fully and unapologetically focus in on our kids' and students' journeys with Jesus. So, empty nester, if you're in the room, single adult, those who don't yet have kids, maybe those who are older students. What if you were one of those 5 to invest in the life of one of these amazing 0 to 18-year-olds? And this finally brings me to those of you in the room who are in that 0 to 18-year-old range. Are you guys sick of me talking about you yet? I would assume so. Instead of me talking about you, I'll talk to you for a second. I love working with you guys. I want to start by saying that it's been really amazing working with you guys, and I love working with you guys, and I look forward to continuing to do that for a while. This morning, if I could challenge you with one simple thing this morning, it would be this. Be willing to be invested in. Be willing to let people break down those walls and develop relationships with you. Be willing to let people who are older and maybe wiser than you invest their time and energy into you so that they can help you grow into who God calls you to be. The truth is that a willing heart is a game changer. If you have a willing heart, man, great things can happen. And I want to see that for you. As I've walked with a few different students over a few different years at a couple different churches, I've noticed a trend. Those who seek out to surround themselves with people who are willing to invest in them and in their journey to follow Jesus are those who excel in their faith in their next phase of life. If you're willing to surround yourself with people who love Jesus and want to help you grow in the next phase of life, you'll be one of those people who will be able to do the same for other people. The truth is that you can seek a lot of things. You can seek a lot of things while you're in high school, you can seek a lot of things while you're in middle school, and you can seek a lot of things after you graduate. Popularity, academic or athletic success, selfish or sinful desires, whatever it may be. But what if you sought to surround yourself with people who are going to help you learn to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind and strength? Now, church, if you can't tell, I get pretty fired up and pretty passionate about this kind of thing. And yes, this is my version of fired up and passionate. So I know we've covered a lot of ground this morning, and I want to make sure that we all walk out of here with something, with some motivation to step up to the call to pass the shema on to the next generation. What I want to do as I close this message is to give you some practical steps that might be worth thinking about. We can consider this the so what section of our gathering this morning. First, this is for every single one of us in the church this morning. Let's shema the shema. Let's be a church that doesn't just hear the call of God and say we love him with all of our being, but instead show it by our actions and our deeds and the things we do for one another and for our community. Let us be a church that shemas the shema. Second, and I'm mainly talking to parents on this one, let's make the countdown count. I had a couple of thoughts. The first thought I had was, wouldn't it be kind of cool if Amazon saw like a spike in the purchase of marbles and like gallon jars after this message? But seriously though, consider maybe purchasing a bunch of marbles for each of your kids. At the end of every week, you pull out 2 marbles. With one, you look at it and you consider how you've done in this past week with your call to raise up your child in the way that they should go. And then you put that marble aside. And with the other one, you process and take a moment to pray and ask God to give you wisdom and courage as you invest in the life of your child, to make the most of the week ahead. And then you put that marble back in the jar. The third thing, and I'm mainly talking to non-parents or grandparents here, let's invest in the next generation. Let's not just want them to do well, let's help them do well. Let's invest our time and energy into relationships with them. Now, this might sound like a recruiting pitch, but don't hear it like that. I want you to hear it as your call as it relates to the Bible, a biblical call to raise up the next generation. You can do that in an official volunteer role. I'm blessed to have really awesome volunteers. I have Mike and Emily and Kelly, and they all do really great jobs. Libby helps me once in a while, too. I meant that in a good way, not like a passive way. And we have all kinds of opportunities that vary in style and commitment level. But you can also simply start by getting intentional with some of the relationships with our students that you already have. I've seen that there are a lot of people in this church who have relationships with our students. You know them and they know you, and you care about one another. I want to encourage you to make that relationship intentional. Take time to invest in that relationship and help that student grow in their relationship with Jesus. And finally, and I'm thinking mainly of families on this one, let's identify the 5. Students, what if you sat down with your parents and identified the 5 individuals who could intentionally invest in your spiritual journey? Here's a hint for you this morning as well. 2 of those should be your parents, your mom and dad. And I know you're still on break and you might not want to do math, so that leaves 3 people left. So think of 3 people who could invest in your spiritual journey, 3 people who would be willing to help you grow. And what if you actually approach those people and those individuals and you let them know that you're willing to be invested in? You tell them that you're open to them discipling you. What if you did that? As I prepared this message, I couldn't help but think about the fact that there's a senior in our group who's graduating this year. It's Faith. And I'll make it quick because I know just the fact that I'm mentioning her name in a sermon is like kind of freaking her out. So I'll continue. I'll go really fast. This will be the first year that I have a student who I saw in middle school and all 4 years of high school graduating. And it's super surreal for me to think about, and it's kind of tough because time's really flown by, and I can't believe that I've been here almost 5 years. It's super weird for me to think about. 5 years. It feels like half of that, maybe even less. This line of thinking started to snowball with me, and I started thinking about how Kayana and Eli and Sam and Jack and Randy, all of those students will one day graduate, and the countdown will be over, and they'll be gone. They'll be out of my ministry. All these students that I invested this time and these relationships, developing these relationships, they'll be gone from here. And there's one thing that I want from those students more than anything else, and that's for them to have a strong, solid foundation that is built on the love of Jesus Christ. And that's not only my job to help them do that, it's yours as well. So, it's got me thinking about how important the time we have with our students really is. It may seem like we have plenty of time. We say that a lot. But it's already 2020. It's crazy how fast the last year went by, and now we think about it, and it's crazy how fast 4 or 5 years can go by. Time isn't as long as we think it is. The time we have with our students is invaluable, and I want to encourage us all in this room this morning to invest in our students. The bottom line this morning is this. When you see how much time you have left, you tend to get serious about the time you have now. My prayer is that we would be a church that would shema the shema, a church that would listen to the call of God, say that we love him, make that our creed, but also to live it out and do it. Not just say we love him, but show that we love him, and that we would pass that on to the next generation, and that we would make the countdown count.